So, can a simple DNA test actually disprove a religion? I mean, that's the huge question here, right? It's at the heart of this whole debate over genetics and the Book of Mormon. So today, we're going to dig into what the science really says and see where that data collides with doctrine. And really, this is the big one. Can something as, well, clinical as a lab test, a DNA sequence, actually reach back through centuries, through millennia, and give a final thumbs up or thumbs down on a story of faith? It's a really powerful thought, and a pretty controversial one too. Okay, so on one side, you've got this really simple, powerful claim. You see it everywhere online. DNA disproves the Book of Mormon. But on the other side, you have the science. And, science is rarely not black and white. So let's peel back some of those layers and see why this is way more complicated than a simple headline. All right, first up, the DNA versus the book. Let's just lay out the basic conflict here. What's really at the heart of this whole debate?
So it really boils down to two completely different origin stories. You've got the genetic research, which paints this big, sweeping picture of migration out of Asia. But then, the Book of Mormon tells a much more specific story, right? A small group migrating from ancient Jerusalem. So the million-dollar question is, do these two stories actually have to be at odds with each other?
Okay, next section, the scientific consensus. Look, to get to the bottom of this, we've got to start with what the data actually shows. So let's take a look at the established, mainstream scientific view on the genetic history of the Americas. And let's be clear, the scientific consensus on this is, well, it's rock solid. I mean, countless studies all point to the very same conclusion. The main ancestry of Native American populations traces back to migrations from Asia, probably from Siberia. This is our baseline, the starting point for this whole conversation. And what's really cool is how specific this all gets. You can think of these genetic markers, these haplogroups. They're kind of like unique family crests passed down through the generations. Scientists have found the key crests, so to speak, for Native American populations, on both the father's and the mother's side. And guess what? All of these genetic trails, they lead straight back to that ancient migration from Asia. So here it is. This is the crucial point. When scientists look at the DNA of indigenous Americans, they just don't see a big, widespread genetic signature from the Middle East. It's not there. And this finding is what sets up the main conflict with at least one popular interpretation of the Book of Mormon. All right, Section 3, a case of lost ancestry. Now this is where things get really interesting. Because it turns out this whole debate isn't just about the raw data, it's about the assumptions we bring to the table before we even look at that data. Okay, look at this, because this gets to the absolute core of the whole thing. See those two different assumptions? If your starting point is that these migrants from the Book of Mormon were the ancestors of all Native Americans, well then yeah, genetics absolutely contradicts that. But what if you start with a different idea? What if you assume they were just one small group that mixed in with lots of other people who are already here? All of a sudden, genetics can't really test that. The entire conclusion flips, depending on where you start. And this brings us to a really important concept in population genetics. A DNA signature, it's not permanent. It's not like a tattoo, especially for a small group that mixes in with a much, much larger one. It's more like, I don't know, a footprint in the sand. It can just get washed away by the waves of a giant gene pool. So, how does this happen? How does a DNA signal just vanish? Well, it's pretty much a four-step process. Step 1, your small founding group arrives. Step 2, they start intermixing with a much bigger population that's already there. Step 3, over generations, their unique DNA just gets watered down. And then Step 4, you have things like random chance, what scientists call genetic drift, and big population crashes or bottlenecks. Those can come in and just wipe the slate clean, erasing whatever little signal was left. The original signature? Poof, it's gone. So let's really unpack the hidden assumptions behind that whole DNA disproves it argument. The idea that one small group has to become the main ancestor for millions of people, or that their specific DNA must be easy to find thousands of years later, these are just assumptions. They aren't scientific facts. In fact, the actual science of population genetics tells us those outcomes are super unlikely. Okay, so where does that leave us? Section 4, Science's honest conclusion. After looking at the data, and maybe more importantly, the assumptions, what can we honestly say? What conclusions can we actually draw from all this genetic information? And this is maybe the single most important takeaway. Just because we can't find a DNA signal today doesn't prove those people never existed. In fact, think about it. For a small group that gets absorbed into a huge population, finding nothing
Well, that's exactly what the science of population genetics would predict. It's that old saying, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And get this is a mind-blowing fact. Over 90%, let that sink in, 90% of the people who lived in the Americas before Columbus, they have left zero genetic trace in today's populations. Their entire DNA lines just died out. So we're basically trying to solve this giant historical puzzle with only a tiny, tiny fraction of the pieces.
And this really shows you the limits of what genetics can do, right? You want to test for a tiny little founding population? Well, its signature is probably gone. You want to search for a group in some unknown location? We wouldn't even know where to start looking. How do you account for huge population collapses that wiped out DNA lines? That's the one thing genetics can't do. It can't test for data that just isn't there anymore.
So this brings us to the really critical distinction we have to make. DNA science, it's an incredibly powerful tool, but it has its limits. It absolutely effectively refutes the simple idea that all Native Americans are descended primarily from one Middle Eastern family. Okay, that's clear. But what it cannot do is disprove the possibility of a much smaller group, a group whose genetic trail just faded away over the centuries. And those are two totally different claims.
Ultimately, it really comes down to using the right tool for the right job. Genetics is amazing, right? It can tell us incredible stories about our deep ancestry and ancient human migrations. But it was never designed to be a tool that can weigh in on theological questions or on prophets, or the spiritual meaning of a sacred text. And so that leaves us with a final, much bigger question, really, for all of us. It's so tempting to want science to just give us a simple yes or no, even when we're talking about faith. But maybe the real lesson here is about understanding the limits of our own tools and being honest with ourselves about which questions science is actually built to answer and which ones, well, it just can't.